Naomi Judd was born Diana Ellen Judd on January 11, 1946, in Ashland, Kentucky, the daughter of a gas station owner. Her early life was shaped by hardship long before fame found her. At 17, she became pregnant and married Michael Simonella, giving birth to her first daughter, Christina, the girl the world would come to know as Naomi Judd, just before her high school graduation. A second daughter, Ashley, arrived a few years later. The marriage did not last. After the couple divorced in 1972, Naomi found herself a single mother raising two young girls largely on her own. To support her daughters, Naomi enrolled in nursing school, eventually working as a registered nurse while the family moved frequently, often living with very little. It was a demanding, unglamorous chapter of her life, one she would later describe candidly in interviews and in her writing. She and her daughters eventually settled in a small Kentucky community, and it was there, almost by accident, that her music career began to take shape. Naomi and Winona started singing together informally, and within a short time, a demo tape led to a record deal with RCA. Their first album arrived in 1984, and it topped the charts almost immediately. Before Naomi Judd became a household name, Larry Strickland had already built a career of his own in music, though in a very different corner of the industry. Born in North Carolina in 1946, the son of a preacher, Strickland grew up steeped in gospel music, singing with quartets across the South from the time he was a boy. After serving 4 years in the U.S. Army, he returned to music full-time, and in 1974 he joined J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet, the gospel group that backed Elvis Presley. Over the next several years, Strickland sang behind Presley in more than 200 live shows, remaining with the group until Presley's death in 1977. In 1979, while Naomi Judd was still working as a nurse in Nashville and years away from the fame that awaited her, she crossed paths with Strickland through their overlapping ties to the local music scene. They connected quickly, but their relationship developed gradually, unfolding over a full decade before they married. On May 6, 1989, they wed at Christ Church in Nashville, with both of Naomi's daughters serving as bridesmaids. By then, Naomi was already one half of the most successful duo in the history of country music, and Strickland, a working musician himself, stepped into a marriage that would place him, for the rest of his life, in the orbit of a genuine superstar. Naomi and Winona Judd's ascent through the 1980s was extraordinary by any measure. Between 1983 and 1991, the pair released 6 studio albums for RCA, scoring 14 #1 singles and more than 20 top 10 hits. They won 5 Grammy Awards, 9 Country Music Association Awards, and 7 Academy of Country Music Awards, selling more than 20 million records along the way. Naomi, the elder and more outspoken of the two, became known not just as a singer, but as the group's business mind and public face. A former nurse and single mother who had willed her way into the biggest stages in American music. Then, in early 1990, everything changed. Naomi was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a serious and at the time poorly understood liver disease, which she had likely contracted years earlier during her nursing career. The diagnosis forced an abrupt halt to the Judds' touring career. In 1991, at the very height of their fame, Naomi announced her retirement from performing, and the duo's farewell tour became one of the most watched events in the history of pay-per-view television. It was, by any account, an ending no one had planned for, a career cut short not by fading popularity, but by a health crisis that threatened Naomi's life. Naomi's retirement from the stage did not mean a retreat from public life. She reinvented herself as an author, television host, and health advocate, writing extensively about her hepatitis C diagnosis and later hosting a talk show on the Hallmark Channel. But behind this new chapter, her marriage to Larry Strickland was going through real strain. Strickland has since acknowledged publicly that the early years of their relationship were complicated by periods of infidelity on his part, something he has expressed regret over in later interviews. Their combined careers, extended time apart, and the pressures of Naomi's fame all placed real weight on a marriage that, on paper, looked like a storybook romance between two working-class musicians who had found each other. The most difficult chapter of that strain became public only decades later. In the 2025 Lifetime documentary The Judd Family, Truth Be Told, Larry Strickland confirmed, for the first time on record, a moment that had long been rumored but never verified. That Naomi had once confronted him with a gun after learning of his infidelity. Strickland did not go into graphic detail about the incident. His confirmation was brief and direct. "It really happened," he said. "That's all I can say." He did not frame the moment as an act of malice, but as evidence of how deeply Naomi's fear of abandonment and emotional pain could surface under pressure. The couple did not separate. They stayed married for another 3 decades, through more successes, more health struggles, and, eventually, through Naomi's declining mental health. Naomi Judd's struggles with mental illness were not, in fact, entirely hidden from the public, though the full extent of them wasn't understood until much later. In 2016, she published a memoir titled River of Time, My Descent into Depression and How I Emerged with Hope, in which she wrote candidly about battling depression and panic attacks so severe that she described them as life-threatening. In interviews promoting the book, she spoke openly about the isolation and fear that came with the illness, describing periods where she could barely function despite her outward success. It was a rare thing at the time for a star of her stature to speak so plainly about mental illness, and the book was widely credited with opening conversations that country music and the broader public hadn't been having. What the public could not see was how much worse things would get in her final years. Strickland has since described watching his wife's condition deteriorate in ways that were difficult to witness and even harder to manage. He has said that in the months leading up to her death, Naomi was seeing several therapists, but her energy levels had dropped sharply, and she had grown noticeably weaker. "It was extremely hard," he told People magazine in an interview published in December 2022. She had several therapists that she was seeing, and her energy level had gotten really low. She was getting really weak. He described the period as a very chaotic, hectic time, a phrase he repeated for emphasis, as if searching for language equal to what the family had been through. On April 29, 2022, Naomi and Naomi Judd were formally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the crowning honor of a career that had begun decades earlier in a Kentucky nursing school. It should have been one of the proudest days of Naomi's life. Instead, the following day, April 30th, 2022, Naomi Judd died at her home in Tennessee at the age of 76 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. She had been scheduled, just hours later, to appear alongside Winona to formally accept the Hall of Fame honor. In a statement released shortly after her death, Winona and Ashley Judd wrote, "Today we sisters experienced a tragedy. We lost our beautiful mother to the disease of mental illness. We are shattered. We are navigating profound grief and know that as we loved her, she was loved by her public. We are in unknown territory." A representative for the family said at the time that Larry Strickland would not be making any further public statements, and the family asked for privacy. For months, that request held. Strickland stayed almost entirely out of the press, mourning privately alongside his stepdaughters. The Country Music Hall of Fame ceremony went forward as planned the day after Naomi's death, a decision the family made because they believed it reflected what Naomi herself would have wanted. Winona took the stage and delivered an emotional tribute to her mother, one that acknowledged both the complexity of their relationship and the depth of what had been lost. It became one of the most talked-about moments in the ceremony's history, a tribute delivered less than 24 hours after unimaginable loss. It took roughly 7 months for Larry Strickland to speak publicly in any depth about what his family had been through. In December 2022, he gave an interview to People magazine and appeared in a segment of the Academy of Country Music's mental health series, Lifting Lives, The Check-In, in which he discussed, for the first time in detail, his wife's decline and his own sense of guilt about not recognizing how serious it had become. Strickland admitted plainly that he had not understood, until it was too late, just how much danger Naomi was in. "I look back at the first of the year, and I see moments and times when my wife was normal and happy," he said in the ACM series. "It just never entered my mind that she was as sick as she was." In the People interview, he went further, reflecting on what he might have done differently in her final months. He described trying to manage her medications, encourage her to eat, and push her toward exercise, efforts he now believes may have added pressure rather than comfort. "I just feel like I might have overdone it," he said. If I had known where she was, I would have been much softer on her. I would have been gentler and more understanding instead of tired and exhausted, because it was wearing me out, too. He added that, knowing now what he didn't know then, he wished he had simply held her rather than push her toward routines that weren't helping. I don't know if that would have helped, he said, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt. Strickland also spoke about what it meant practically and emotionally to be the spouse of someone living with serious mental illness for more than a decade. I never left the house without Naomi knowing where I was going and when I would be back, he told People, describing the vigilance that had become part of daily life in their marriage. He described caregiving not as a burden he resented, but as an inescapable part of loving her. When you have a mate that has a mental illness, he said, you walk that path with them. It was, in its own way, a definition of loyalty, one built not on grand gestures, but on 13 years of quiet, exhausting attentiveness that in the end he still felt hadn't been enough.